Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Hyperconscious Podcast. Alan, what is hyperconscious?
Once you understand why something is the way that it is, now you have the power to change it. Great conversations with great people and great questions are the keys to the kingdom of unlocking your consciousness.
Every single action that you do starts as a thought. When you control the way you think, you will control the way you act, and you will control the way you live. That is hyperconscious. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another very special, as always, episode of the Hyperconscious Podcast. We have new headphones if you're watching us. If you are listening to us, we're hearing ourselves clearly and crispy.
For sure.
We have a very
crispy.
We have a very special episode. We hope you enjoyed our latest Scratching the Surface episode on being proactive versus reactive. Our guest today is Toria Leto. She is a family therapist and licensed marriage counselor. She is at New York Therapist on the gram. This was a super interesting episode because Alan and I set the intention a while back to have like a therapist on and ask questions that we wanted to know like professionally. So We talked about sex, we talked about relationships. I know you're going to give some details. So you give some details.
So I think many of us have fallen in love in our life, and I think that falling in love kind of just happens a little bit more organically, but I think sustaining love and passion over the long term is far more challenging. She went over the top 5 things that she notices in an intimate relationship that are important. Number 1 is expecting change. Number 2 is to keep yourself accountable. Number 3 is prioritizing time. Number 4 is getting to know each other. And then number 5 is adversity is what helps advance the relationship and understanding those things. So she goes deeper into each of these topics on the episode. Kevin and I were basically going back and forth the whole time.
We were fighting for questions.
Right, and that means it's a great rep, so do not miss this one.
Yes, so as I have said in past episodes, if you are in a relationship, if you have had relationships fail and you're not sure why, or you're planning on getting in a relationship anytime soon, this is the episode for you. Tory dropped so much knowledge, and we're very grateful for her, so we hope you will enjoy.
Talk to you soon.
Bye. No. Geographically? Geographically. This is cool. So I would say make sure that pretty face is showing.
Yes, true.
They're going to want to see that thing. They're going to want to see that thing, Alan. That face. You good?
Ready?
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another very special, as always, episode of the Hyperconscious Podcast. Today's guest is a licensed marriage and family therapist. She is a certified Daring Way facilitator and a writer. We are sitting down with Toria Leto. How are you doing, Tory?
Hello. Thank you for having me. I'm well. I'm excited to be here.
We are super excited. We were just having a little bit of a preamble, and I told Tory that I basically came across her profile, and her Instagram profile is like a bunch of super smart quotes and sayings, and it's stuff that really makes you think. And when I created this podcast, my goal was to get in the minds of people who thought like I wanted to think. So I texted Alan and said, hey, we have to have her on. Reach out because you are the guy who gets the people.
Yeah. So I did, and here we are.
And here we are. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. All right. So one of the first things I read when I did research on you was, and I quote, I have lots of training and experience, but my main job is to help you tap into your expertise. How does somebody figure out what their expertise is?
Oh, that's a good question. I think when people come into my room or decide to work with me, they tend to look for guidance outside of themselves. And my goal is to kind of have them connect to sort of their inner wisdom, because we all have it. We just don't always necessarily know how to connect to it, listen to it, and make decisions from it. So that's sort of like where I try to go with clients.
Yeah. So one of the things that I noticed, so I'm a coach as well, and what people come to me for is different than a lot of times what they actually need. So, for example,
Yeah.
they think they need a diet program or a fitness regimen. I often say that a lot of people can teach you how to get in shape, but very few people can get you to do it. So we have this sort of system we think of PMES, so physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. The physical is the sort of results that they're coming to me to try to get, but it's actually the mental, emotional, and spiritual side that allows me, that's kind of holding up the iceberg that they're seeing from an outside perspective. So why do people come to you? And then I guess what's some of the most common things that you notice that is holding people back once they get to you?
I mean, I think usually people come to me either they're in a period of distress, like anxiety, or they're feeling sad or stuck. And a lot of times, relational issues, if they're struggling in some relationship in their lives, it's usually what gets people in the door. And I agree with you. It generally isn't just that. There's so many other moving parts to what's going on for people. And I think it's like a space to like organize and make sense of what's actually happening within someone. I don't know if I answered your question though. What was your question?
So one of them was basically like, what is some of the most common things that you find in terms of emotional or mental bottlenecks that are actually holding people back? Because a lot of times what they think is the problem is not, usually it's deeper.
Yes. Yeah, I think expectations of where people should be or what relationships should look like or what their career should look like, that's always such a big one, because I think even though we all want to say we're like, excited to be on our own individual journey, I think there's so much that competes with that in our minds and outside of us, and it creates so much stress to think that we're kind of going about our own path in the wrong way, or if you ended up getting married and getting a divorce, just kind of dealing with the bumps in the road. So I think expectation is a big one that kind of makes people feel sort of more stressed and trapped than they realize.
We actually just did an episode recently on expectations and how it basically determines your experience. It's either better than or worse than you expected. So I love that you went there. So one of the things that I was super excited to ask, because I think nowadays, and I do want to ask about social media as well. I have a million questions, Tori. I have all the questions.
I like this. I'm excited.
But so it's interesting, because if I was to ask Alan, hey, Alan, how is your relationship? I can't necessarily base my relationship off of Alan's, because I don't know how well he's actually doing in his. Like, his perception may be, I'm doing great, but his significant other might not feel the same. So when it comes to a healthy, successful relationships, what do you think like the top 5 things are to like keep a good, healthy relationship?
I think that first we have to expect that even when we get to a good place, it's not going to stay. Like anything else in life, things are changing, moving, flowing. So we have to create room for that. I think 2 people who are able to be self-accountable is really important. And I'm not saying that that's not an easy skill set. And sometimes there's things, about ourselves that are harder to face or admit. But if we can go there, which is very vulnerable, you tend to see people a lot more connected to each other. I think prioritizing time for the connection, especially some of the intimate parts, depending on where you're at in your relationship stages, but just kind of prioritizing time together and getting to know each other. I think one of the downfalls I see is people think they know so much about their partner that they sort of like, it gets a little stale, but we're moving, we're always growing, changing. So to kind of reinvest and be interested in the person that's in front of you, I think is important. I think addressing things before they become big, before they overtake the relationship is a big one. So kind of doing more preventative work versus work when we're in a space where we have to sort of be more reactive because things have blown up.
Those are.
Yeah.
You just did 5. I didn't know if you were done, but if you have an extra one, do it, please.
Oh, okay. That's my 5th one. If I think of something else, I'll add it on. But those.
So just to reiterate, I wrote them down. The first one is expect things to change. Second one is self-accountable, which requires vulnerability. Third one is prioritizing quality time, both intimately and fun, unique experiences. The fourth is getting to know each other and never stop learning each other. And then the 5th one is my favorite one, actually, which is being proactive about sort of anticipating the problems before they happen. So at the tail end of my last relationship, she had finally convinced me to go to couples therapy, which, as you probably know, a lot of guys need some convincing.
Yes.
And I actually
That is for
now,
sure.
right, so I wish that I had done it sooner. She had been trying to get me to go for, I think, like the last probably 5 months of our relationship. And I think it was in an effort to really just create a space where we can openly talk and be honest, where there aren't any triggers and it's not one against another, but like actually just kind of being on a team and figuring out what's real.
Right.
And now I actually, in the future, my next significant my next relationship, I actually want to go weekly or bi-weekly minimum just to be more proactive. So out of those 5 things, are those in order of most importance, do you think, from your perspective? I'm totally curious.
I think I'd have to say the most important is being able to be self-accountable.
Can you go deeper on that, please? Because I totally,
Yeah.
I think we tend to blame others
Mm-hmm.
for sort of some of our own shortcomings instead of, trying to really own our own things and improve them.
Yeah, I mean, it's natural too to do that, and I think we're really good at seeing other people's shortcomings, right? Especially when we're in a relationship, it's pretty easy to point out. But if we look at it, if we frame it in the space where we're entering a relationship with someone we hopefully trust and want to build with, that they're going to be our greatest mirror, and if we can kind of take that and hear from them what they notice about us and what their concerns are or needs that aren't getting met, they're usually highlighting areas for us to pay attention to and to look at and potentially grow in. So if we have the ability to do that without becoming defensive or feeling like we're losing ourselves and our own truth, then we have the ability to kind of allow each other to influence one another. And I think that's what makes a really strong union.
Tory, you said prioritizing time together, and I think it's probably easier in the beginning because, like you said, you're always growing, evolving, changing, and as you get deeper into that evolution, you grow together and separately. So, like, I am in a new relationship now, and I'm finding that, okay, it's a lot harder to not prioritize the time because it is a priority, but finding the actual time between doing our podcast episodes, and we have 3 other episodes that we do every week, and there's so much stuff. But
Yes.
And I'm still early in it. So when you get later in a relationship and you're married and you have kids and you have to take care of the yard, how do you prioritize making sure that you're showing that love and you're getting that passion and intimacy?
Oh, it's so hard. But it's a work in progress. So I mean, it's creating time that you don't have, right? Because you have to put things aside in order to make sure. It's like anything else. If you're putting energy towards, feeling healthy for yourself or your podcast or your career, you got to put the same energy into your relationship to kind of maintain it. So it's carving it out. And usually it probably means neglecting something else, which I think ends up being the juggle of busyness. But and also I think smaller moments, they don't always have to be these large, big, like, dates that take hours. It can be, I mean, these little moments of connection that kind of end up filling up the tank, so to speak. So those are a big one too, especially when there's so much going on and you throw in kids and house and all those things. The smaller moments become bigger, I think.
So I recently read something. I forget which book it was. Oh, it's Essentialism. I don't know if you've read Essentialism. If you haven't, it's one of my favorite books of all time. I've actually got it on the.
No, I haven't.
Oh, Greg McKeown. It's absolute fire. But he talks about how we all have friends, we all have family, we all have career, we all have our health, and at any given time there has to be one priority, especially when the time and energy we're putting into something conflicts. So a lot of the time there is no conflict. In other words, you can integrate them, but there always has to be one that's most important. In terms of seeing relationships shift from failing, quote unquote, to succeeding, is it usually, I guess, have you found that the priority was career before or that the priorities were mixed up? What's your take on that?
I think sometimes, I mean, it depends. That definitely shows up where one or both people are really focused on their career. They lose that space between the two of them. But I see it more as, I think what blocks, I guess, that the prioritizing the time or dedicating time to it is more the idea that you have to. Because I think there's some belief that things should come easy. And not that there isn't some truth to that, but I think you have to define what easy means. Because easy meaning it just kind of letting it go versus easy because you're putting in the moments to make it easy is very different.
Right.
So I think it's more about that. I think people don't realize that, we we realize we have to put work in if we want to be healthy. We realize we have to put work in if we want to be successful. But sometimes we think that marriage in particular should just kind of flow. And that's obviously not the case.
That story that is being perpetuated of I can't even tell you how many times people are like, oh, it should just work out. It's like, well, if both parties are chasing their dreams, both parties are changing a lot, and you cannot grow without changing, then it's going to require some check-ins. It's going to require some conscious effort.
Yes.
So why do you think that everyone seems to be, not everyone, but this is something that I get very fired up about, because I do think that a lot of people are under this impression that achieving your dreams is supposed to be easy. Achieving your dream relationship is supposed to be easy. Your relationship is supposed to just work. And if it doesn't just work, there's something wrong with it. I think that's honestly crap. And I really want your take on that. Why do you think that is?
Crap.
Yeah.
I agree with you. It is crap.
That's the technical term, really, is crap.
Why do I think people go there or assume that it should be?
Why do you think that we fall under that impression? Why do you think culture sort of, I guess, where do you think that story comes from? Because I couldn't disagree more with the idea that life is supposed to be easy and that relationships are supposed to be easy. I actually think that anything worth having is going to be challenging, and that's where all the growth is.
I agree.
Yeah, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure the idea of why things are meant to be easy. And I mean, I think people definitely apply it to work and career and success. But in relationships, I think it's really applies there. Like, you see people who are really hardworking in a lot of areas of their life, but when it comes to relationships, in my opinion, it's the most vulnerable space to be in. Because let's say you're really good at your job and you know it, and even if it's difficult or vulnerable, you still are kind of like working hard and seeing the success. Relationships, the kind of growth that they require, I think really just kind of makes us face parts of ourselves that a lot of people aren't really ready to face or know that they need to face. And it's a much difficult space, I think, to even grow in.
Can you give us an example of one of those growth points? I know I'm kind of taking you through the gauntlet here, but I'm so curious, because if I'm honest with myself, I always ask myself, okay, I'm very mastery driven, and if I cannot consistently and sustainably produce the outcomes that I want to see, then I have not mastered that arena. And when it comes to intimate relationships, this has been one of the biggest challenges for me personally. So what's an area that I could potentially grow in, or a listener could potentially grow in, that would have the biggest impact on their future relationships?
I think the challenge that I think that's the biggest difference right there, because I align with you in that I think I subconsciously became a relational therapist thinking that if like I learned how things go, that I can make my relationship perfect, or not perfect, but that it wouldn't fail, or it wouldn't kind of get ugly or messy or painful. And I think that the most humbling thing being in my relationship and now marriage is that there's really no way to do that. You actually have to just be in it. It's such a different process, I think, than anything else in our lives. Maybe raising children can be a little bit similar, but it's a different process. Like, there's always new stages and new things to kind of work on and new ways to kind of see yourself. And it's so ongoing. And at times it's more in that vulnerable stage than in that master stage. And if it wasn't, like, I would probably share with you all the tips to master it, but it really requires a lot of, like, you have to be super humble, and I think that's very difficult for most people who are actually really doing and like killing it in their lives in other ways. It's like you can't necessarily bring that same skill set to a relationship.
That resonates very strongly with me.
I'm going to try to word a question, and in my head I have all the words. I just don't know if they're going to come out in the right way. So,
okay,
for me, literally, when I would go to bed for the last like 4 or 5 months, I would write down in my journal, I am grateful for my unbelievable girlfriend and my awesome relationship. And this was before I even had a relationship. So I've been trying to manifest this and visualize this. But I have noticed how much I have changed over just since the time that we've gotten together. It's only been a couple months. Now, I'm so happy and so grateful and so blessed that she is as into personal development and getting better and learning and growing as I am. So say somebody who is in my position, who is unbelievably into personal development, it basically is my life. I'm trying to become the best in the world at this. Say I'm dating somebody and they don't have the same passion for getting better. How do I go about either, because you don't want to change, quote unquote, change somebody, right? But
right.
what if that's something new to me? Like, what if I just got into personal development and when we got together, I really wasn't into it that much, and now I kind of want to help bring that to her? Is that a thing I can do? And is it like that with anything? Like, because people, like you said, they obviously grow and they evolve. So is that something that you can speak on and help us with?
Yeah, I mean, I think it all it takes is the openness and the willingness to do it. I think that, and on the other end of it, if someone's been working on themselves for years, they have to be mindful of the pacing of the other person. But I don't necessarily think, in every situation, there's two people that are super invested in their growth and they're willing to kind of show up. That's nice. That sounds lovely and wonderful, and I think that couple will thrive. But that's not always the case, and I think that it's more about just the willingness to start, right? And to say, like, yes, this is the kind of relationship I want, and what does that look like, and what does that require, and do I need to go to some individual therapy to see myself, or whatever it is. So I think it's definitely possible to do it with someone who's willing and open.
Interesting. If they aren't willing and open, or maybe not into personal development yet, is there any easy way to bring that up? Because you don't want to come to someone and say, well, I'm really working on myself to try to show up better in this relationship, and I don't feel like that's being reciprocated. Have you found yourself trying to help someone who maybe really is into personal development, but the other person in the relationship is just not really open to growth and to learning and to improving?
Yes.
What do you typically advise for them?
Well, it depends. It depends what they're looking on, and if they're coming in as a couple to work on stuff, we sort of start there and what that means. Because sometimes someone is really adamant and they just don't want to go there, and that's that's fine. That's what it is. But then the other person on the other end, if this is where they want the relationship to go, or the way that they see their lives, then it's a very difficult combination, because you're doing all the work on one end. Though I will tell you, I have couples who've been married, for 25 years, where one person all of a sudden starts to do some self-work, and the other person almost feels like, whoa, this is not what we were doing. Why are you bringing this up now? And there's still room for growth there. I think we can still, first of all, shift a lot in our relationships on our own. I work with a lot of people who have like a resistant partner to therapy, and they still can make great changes. It's not quite the same or as effective when two people are working on it, but there's still a lot you can do and work on and move, just working on yourself and your patterns and your end of the patterns in the relationship.
Can I go again, Kev?
Yeah, you can go again, Alan. I'll just sit here with my mouth shut.
Yeah, right. That resonates very strongly. It sounds like you have some extremely empowering beliefs about relationships. I like that you're saying even with one resistant partner, it's totally doable to keep making improvements. So you wrote something on your Instagram that really jumped off the page for me. It said, and I quote, "The pattern is more powerful than the person." Can you go deeper into that? What did you mean by that?
Yeah, that's the first thing that I do with couples, especially couples who come in and are very reactive. But the first thing I do is I draw it. Like, I have a whiteboard and a marker, and we draw out the couples patterns. Because what you end up finding is couples that struggle to communicate and have this sort of growing relationship, they get so caught up in these, I guess they view as communication, but they're reactive patterns. And the reactive patterns end up hijacking the ability to even get to the important stuff, right? Like the good content that you actually want to talk about.
100%.
So I start there. And I outline it for people so they can visually see it. And our first like step is to kind of start to pay attention to how much these patterns are sort of coming up in the relationship, and how can we own our role in the pattern in order to shift it so we can get to a place to really communicating about the important stuff.
So you obviously know a lot about relationship dynamics. You know a lot about people. I read this somewhere, it was a couple years ago, and I think it was before social media was as prominent as it is now. But what are the few top pain points when it comes to relationships, like intimacy, money, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think the three are sex, money, and children. Those are the tough ones for people.
How do people get? So let's just say it's intimacy. Say it's sex. Yeah. And we'll just say in this example that the man wants it more than the woman does, because, I feel like that's probably somewhat accurate, or somewhat,
sure.
What's the word I'm looking for?
Applicable.
Happens often. That's the word I'm looking for.
Common.
Common. So how does that come out through therapy? How does that come out in like the vulnerable space of being able to share how you really feel? And how does a couple work through that with you? I love being able to ask these questions.
Yeah, we're really
this is
throwing you
like-
through the gauntlet here. We really appreciate you bearing with us because Kevin and I are like fighting to ask you things. Oh, this is great.
Well, that's an important one because that's a tough topic. And actually, I will tell you this. I would say even 75% of the couples I deal with, it's the opposite, where the female, obviously if it's a heterosexual relationship, but
Right.
the female is actually wants more intimacy, and the males are not wanting it as much, which I think is very interesting. It's like a shift I've noticed in my practice. But what I deal with it is, first off, it's really important to know that in every relationship, there is somebody, I'm thinking of the wording. There's someone who has a higher drive and a lower drive. They're always sort of paired together. And sometimes the drives shift and change, obviously, through different stages of life. But it's very, very rare to see two people who have the same drive. So it's quite common and normal. And I think once people hear that, there's some relief because it's like, okay, cool. We're not destined to fail. What do we do now? And it's really about working with the patterns of their intimacy and what their intimacy looks like. Because there's so many ways you can go. Sometimes it's about other parts of the connection. And sometimes it's generally about how do you maintain the mystery and excitement in a long-term relationship, right? It can just be that. So there's so many different versions of this. But I think once people hear how normal it is, it just takes like a big relief because it's such a fearful area, and it's such a difficult one.
Right. Yeah. I've been there for sure.
Yeah.
What do you attest that shift to? So going from, men wanting it more to then women wanting it more. Do you think, is there something that's responsible for that, or is it just kind of an ebb and flow thing?
Oh, I think it shifts. It shifts between couples. I think porn is a big one. Again, that could come up on both ends, but that is certainly a big one that seems to come up. And I think just, I'm not really even sure. There's something about the last, 10, 20 years or so, where maybe women are connecting more with their sexuality, and something where you notice a lot more numbing with men, whether it's like video games, porn, whatever. So it's really kind of about looking at some of those dynamics that contribute. But I've seen that actually more than the opposite now, which I think is very interesting.
I read a quote recently that literally I know will change my life. It already has. It was, I believe, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, I think. But it was basically this. The quality of your relationship will ultimately be determined by how much each party appreciates the differences. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I find most fascinating is that our ego kind of tells us like, oh, how come she's not more like me? Or how come he's not more like me? But it's like, wait a minute, that's the reason you're attracted sexually to the other person. It's the polarity. How can we explain this in a way where men, like the masculine energy, the feminine energy, they are polar differences. They're polar opposites, but there's also common values and core values that maybe keep the relationship together. I've noticed, and this is just my own speculation, this is not based in any real science or anything like that, but I've noticed some relationships are a little bit more of a roller coaster, but they have incredible sexual, passionate relationships. And then other people are like best friends, but there's not a lot of like sex there. And so their relationship is great in terms of like their day-to-day, but the polarity isn't really there.
Right.
Can you please give me your take on that and how to dance between those two extremes, effectively?
Yeah, well, I'll share you this, and if you're not familiar with Esther Perel, I think she's amazing in this space right now, because she talks about how all of the goodness of having that best friendship, that companionship, the safety, the warmth, the routine, the person who's predictable, creates sort of a really nice relationship and or marriage. But the parts that bring up like that natural intimacy and desire come from the more dangerous, sometimes volatile, mysterious people that we don't see every day when we're in our regular routine. A little mystery, a little difference. And sometimes when you notice the up and downs of a relationship kind of filtering into the sexual life, it's because there's so much separation when there's fighting, right? We're like totally on the opposite ends of the spectrum. So there's like autonomy there, and that creates some of that intimate, natural like adrenaline, versus when you're so close to someone, some of that kind of floats away. It almost feels like, I think she describes it like your autonomy kind of shifts a bit, especially when you're with someone for so long, that like they become like a family, and that natural sexual drive is very difficult to kind of keep intact. which is why I put that as one of my priorities, because trying to rediscover things about your partner can help you kind of connect to that space where you're like, oh, this person's separate from me. You know, they're not, just because I see them every morning brushing their teeth, there's still a separateness about them that's attractive, or when they're in their mode, I'm attracted to them, or when they're, you know, so something about the space that really helps us connect to that attraction. But it's difficult in conjunction to the things that we like that are very cozy about the other side of the best friendship relationship.
Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you were enjoying this episode where Alan and I were lucky enough to sit down with Tory Leto. I know I mentioned this in a couple episodes previous, but if you go to the hyperconsciouspodcast.com/book suggestions, you will find a list of the books that have changed Alan and I's life. If you purchase them through those links, so you can click on the picture of the book or buy now, it'll take you to Amazon, and we are now Amazon affiliates. So if you purchase the book, we will get a small percentage for every book you purchase. It will not cost you a cent more, I promise.
And before we jump back into Tory, I just want to mention that we have our very first event at the Confident Women's Consortium coming up. The Hyperconscious Podcast will be there.
Yes.
And we want you to be there so that we can finally meet you in person. So if you go to the hyperconsciouspodcast.com/events, it's on July 25th from 6:30 to 9. There will be dinner served. It's a buffet with chicken, I believe.
Nom, nom, nom.
Shout out to Joyce M. Strong for helping us set this up. Kevin will be speaking on how to cultivate confidence, and I will be speaking on fitness and how to look as good on the outside as you are on the inside. I'm going to teach you everything I know, and we can't wait to meet you.
Do you think we should get back into the episode?
I do think
All right. We hope you enjoy.
Talk soon.
Bye.
Right. Very well. Absolute
fire.
Thank-
I knew he
thank
was
you
going to
for
say
that.
it.
Yeah.
All right, Tory. So we spoke a little bit about social media, but so you're a marriage and family therapist. So that means you work with families and parents and stuff like that. Have you seen a big shift over the past few years when it comes to like a child-parent dynamic because of social media? Or not necessarily because of it, but I'm sure it has something to do with it. I think social media has a lot to do with a lot of things that are going on because I don't think our brains know how to deal with all this information that we're given yet. So have you seen a shift when it comes to that relationship between parent and son, daughter? What's the word I'm looking for? Child.
Yeah, child.
I'm fried right now. And do you think it's because of social media or do you think it's because of something else?
I mean, I think social media heightens everything, you know? So it's like if there's a potential, obviously, for a couple of an affair, social media just gives an easier access to those avenues. So the same thing with parent and child. You know, if there's some bullying going on or some things happening at school, social media just enhances the abilities to do that and to feel left out. And you know, I mean, there's so many things that go on with social media nowadays, but it certainly just enhances the issues that are already there, in my opinion.
Well, we sat down with a while ago, Carolyn Zani. She's a teacher. And she was talking about bullying and how one of the big issues is when you take these kids off of the platforms, they get really bad FOMO. And it's almost, it's just as bad as like the bullying. And it really is an interesting time to be alive because Alan and I are both 30 years old. So we remember the times before cell phones. I remember what a recording machine, an answering machine is. Like, I know what that is. A lot of people don't.
Right.
So
Payphones.
I know what it's like to go hours and days without talking to somebody, and now it's a very different time. It's a very unique time.
Different time.
Well, as long as my girlfriend in middle school had me in her AIM info with a smiley face and a heart, we're good.
You're good.
We're good.
That's what matters.
No, it's so much more complicated. I feel bad for these kids and teens navigating this.
Because the emotional maturity and emotional mastery that it takes to deal with life regularly, never mind amplify it across social media, it genuinely is something that we all obviously have to adapt to. It's not going away, but I do think it's important to talk about.
And we don't have anybody to teach us about it yet either.
Right, because it's brand new.
It's so new that everybody's...
It's so new.
I had a moment today where I was like, how does this golden retriever have more followers than I do? And then 20 minutes later, I'm watching him eat chicken. And I'm like, yeah, that's why. This is cool. I like this.
Right.
So it happens to everybody, you know. It's just, it's an interesting time.
I think it's because your content sucks.
Well,
no, I'm kidding.
that's probably it.
I'm kidding.
I like
You know
dogs.
what's interesting too is seeing people like, you know, look at that like influencer world and like that being a career choice in their minds. That's also an interesting thing.
Yeah, I think about that all the time.
Yeah.
They literally get they get free dog food, they get free toys because they sponsor them. So it can be a negative, but also on the same line, now is the best time ever when it comes to being successful at almost anything. If you can figure out a way to get good at something and broadcast it, the sky is really the limit.
It's so true.
Now we know. So, go ahead. Sorry, Tori. Go ahead.
Alan's gonna make a
what are you
joke.
gonna say?
He's gearing up for a joke.
Now we know why he's jealous, because they get free dog food and toys. What were you gonna say, Tori? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, but it's true. Yeah, there's both ends of the spectrum here, and there's so many interesting opportunities, and yet it's also really makes things difficult too. It's an ongoing conversation, definitely, with parents and children and how to navigate this. It's very difficult.
Do you find that to be one of the biggest pain points between a disconnect between a parent and a child? Because the world has changed more in the last 20 years than the previous 300. I was just reading a book on George Washington, because I want perspective. Like in the late 1700s, it wasn't like that long ago. And I remember as a kid, like visiting his home and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, the world is so drastically different now that I feel like we've lost sight of some of the fundamentals. Do you find that when you're working with families, like one of the biggest disconnects between kids and parents is just this ridiculous amount of like smartphone, social media, internet world?
Yeah, because I do think too, at their young ages, that's also how they form connection, which is why coming off social media is such a big deal, or not playing Fortnite is such a big deal,
right? Because
they're like almost like socially isolated because of it. So it's how they're forming connections, sometimes more so than in person, as we all know. So, yeah, it's tricky and it's hard to navigate, but it's not going anywhere. So we have to figure out how to navigate it. Because I know some people's answers is to kind of remove it, which I get. And in some instances it makes sense, but really it's figuring out how to learn what to do with it all and make sense of it. I think
in time, it's just like anything else. Like, I'm sure when the TV first came out, people were they parked their asses in front of the TV and just were like, well, I'm going to watch this miracle all day, and now I think that we have all these things that are pulling at our attention. And if you can figure out how to use them for good, which I think most people do, I also think that most social media platforms are designed to get you not necessarily addicted, but there's a reason why when you're looking at dogs, for instance, that then, when you scroll down, it's more dogs and it's more dogs and it's more dogs.
Yeah.
It's designed for that reason. So just to jump on a different topic, you are also an expert in Brene Brown's resiliency theory. And that's something that Alan and I have really been practicing. We're trying to practice vulnerability. Mm-hmm. And I know Brene is very big on that. Now, when it comes to a successful relationship, even a parent-child relationship, how important is being vulnerable, and why is it important?
Oh, I think I would argue and say it's the most important, or one of the most important. Because so much of this stuff is vulnerable. I have a 2-year-old, and I would tell you, I've done a lot of work on myself, and she kicks my ass. Like, it's so interesting. All these different stages of life, they bring out different parts of you, and I think we can either go, and which we probably all can relate to, different generations of just like ways to make kids fearful or to kind of get control. But when you step into this like vulnerable space, you're also not only looking at it like, how can I move through this and make sense of it, but you're modeling it for your child, and also in a partnership too. So I think it's probably the most important. And now that when I did the training under her, and now that I hear shame and vulnerability, it's kind of like all I see. It's so interesting. It's like, it's just so visible now when you have the wording and the understanding of how much of this stuff shows up.
Can you please, just for repetition's purposes, because we did an episode on vulnerability, and I realized that was a huge breakthrough for me. What's your definition of vulnerability now that you've mentioned that it's the most important thing?
I guess it's the choice to show up and kind of face whatever that feels like in your body, in your mind, but it's showing up. I guess that's the way that I would describe it. And what that means is, like, in hard moments where you kind of want to be reactive or move away or be defensive, like, you just sort of show up in that like space where your whole body's like, ugh, but you're there and you're listening and you're trying to navigate things, or you decide to make a jump, in your career, and you put yourself out there, but there's fear and discomfort and all the things that are sort of associated with that seem great, but really they don't feel great all the time. So it's just choosing to show up and kind of feel some of that in order to kind of get the things and, move towards the things that we want in life. So maybe that's how I describe it, though I'm sure that's not the definition.
No, I appreciate that. A leap of faith, really. And I just interrupted Kevin again. I'm
Per
sorry.
the usual.
I'm sorry, brother. I live by a quote: the suppression of self-expression leads to depression. This came to me like 3 or 4 years ago, and
Yeah, I
what
like
I've
that.
found with a lot of my what I've found with a lot of my female clients in particular, a lot of them really struggle to express their truth. Whether they were criticized growing up, or maybe, their significant other, a guy, lost their temper when they did it, and I'm as guilty of that as anybody. But like, what I try to tell them is like, you're gonna feel terrible if you aren't at least honest with yourself and with your partner. You
Yeah.
really do have to be vulnerable, take that leap of faith, and like express what's real, express what's true, because this is verbatim from what one of my clients said. For some reason, we think that men are supposed to read our minds.
Yes.
And I've found that in my relationships too. It's like, I want him to know
know.
what to do, even though I've never told him what to do.
Yeah.
And as a guy, that is so difficult, because we think so differently a lot of the times. I'm reading 2 different books. One is the male brain, one is the female brain. I've been studying them for a long time. And just biochemically, I mean, the brains are just completely different. So
different. Yep.
what is your take on, I guess, that sort of he's supposed to read my mind type of thing? I don't want him to do the dishes. I want him to want to do the dishes type of thing. What do we do about that?
Well, at first we have to acknowledge that that's what we're looking for. But the other part of it is, and this comes into play with just understanding the person in front of you. And, if it's understanding how your boyfriend, partner, whoever, how they operate, so that you can start to, instead of just hoping for certain things, you actually like create a system that can make these things make sense. So I'll give you an example, like the dishes, right? Wanting to do the dishes or thinking about the dishes. I find a lot of my male clients, which is interesting about the brain, is that they have more of a tunnel vision. So they're not necessarily noticing the dishes. They're focused on one thing, and that's where they are. Whereas women tend to be more aware and multitask in that space in a more natural state. So that causes a lot of difficulties in couples, I notice. And it's also just first realizing that just because he didn't clean the dishes, it doesn't mean he doesn't care, love you, or want to help.
Right.
It's sort of how he operates. And just because you're aware of that, it doesn't mean anything either. It's how do we create a system to make sense of the differences, because they're both also positive as well in many ways. So it's kind of breaking through some of that. It's the, what it is? It's the story we assign to why someone's doing something, right? That's some of the Bernie stuff. That's what we have to look at, because that's, I'd say 9 out of the 10 times why people have issues with this stuff. Once I tell couples, oh, this is a common issue, again, it's another thing that people feel relieved about, because they're like, oh, this is why, and let's create a system of functioning versus keep fighting someone to think like me or to act like me or to behave like me.
Tori, you read my mind. I had a quote that I was getting ready to hammer off that you said, and I was going to connect it to Brene Brown. You said, it's so important to know that we see everything through a lens. If we don't know what our lens is or where it comes from, we believe it to be our truth. And I watched the Brene Brown special on Netflix, and since then, I've really been trying to say the story I'm telling myself, telling myself.
Yes, I know, I loved that.
So can you go into how does that actually help? Because in the moment, it's really hard for me to say, like Alan and I have had instances where I'll get insecure because he's just talking the whole freaking time. And, yes, but, and I revert to, I haven't always been a super confident person, so I revert to that person. Then I have to take a step back and say, Kevin, the story you were telling yourself is Alan is taking over this conversation, when in reality, I'm just being insecure because I'm not feeling confident enough to interrupt him and try to add value to the conversation. So for me, it's something that I've practiced and I am definitely getting better at. It's definitely not a habit. It's not second nature yet, but
no.
How can somebody really take that step back and get that overview of like, okay, this is actually why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling, and kind of work themselves through that process?
I think that when we start to kind of if we form a lens of always having it come back to us, that doesn't mean that we're always responsible for what's happening, obviously, nor should we be, but we always have a role in something. And if you keep reframing the situations to like, what do I need here? So I could focus on the other person and what they're doing, how frustrating I am, and the story that's coming up about why, or I can figure out what is, and I always say like the growth area. What's my growth area? Do I need to have boundaries? Do I need to speak up? Do I need to be more assertive? And when we shift it back to being about us, I mean, first of all, it's the truth, but also we're empowered because we have a space to move and to grow versus figuring like, whatever's happening is the other person's fault, and so we have no room or no movement there. So I think it's kind of developing the space of like, where am I? What am I? What's the story I'm creating? And what do I need to do in this situation versus what is this person doing and why? And kind of putting our energy outward.
Tory, I have something that I feel compelled to ask
Oh,
you as
boy.
this conversation comes up.
Okay.
Two questions, really. The first one is, do you find that in most intimate relationships, there's one person who's far more ambitious? That's the first question. The second question is, in those cases, I've found in my intimate relationships that I think my partner a lot of times it feels like they're trying to compete with my ambition, try to get my time, try to get me to care about things that maybe aren't. You mentioned tunnel vision. I have that for sure. For sure. And I think that's my greatest power, laser focus.
I bet, yep.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not exactly a multitasker. I can do one thing really well anytime
Or
I
fun.
chase. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. I'm not if you come to me, it's not usually for fun. But I'm also working on that because fun, unique experiences. Again, it's not about only doing what I love. It's about doing what the people I love, and enjoying that with them, and that actually makes the experience better. So the first question again. Do you find that most of the time there's someone who's way more ambitious in the relationship? And then number two, in those instances, how does the more ambitious person communicate that this is actually a good thing and that we're on a team with this and maybe mitigate some of the challenges that come with that?
So I call it, I think that I call it the energy of the relationship, we're usually one person, I'd say, not always, but in a lot of dynamics, is the energy of the relationship or has more energy, whether that energy is going towards the ambition in their work or just wherever. And one person's sort of the more passive person, if that's the right wording.
Mm-hmm.
I find that dynamic a lot. And I think what you try to look at is each end of that spectrum is trying to probably teach the other something.
Yes.
So the person who is, in your case, you,
Yes.
I relate to. I think I am that person as well. Where you're kind of like tunnel vision, or you work really hard for something, and there's like, for me, I know it can lead me to be a little bit more impulsive, or there's like a drive there that sometimes I don't always see everything else that needs to be seen. So I think in the other end of having the other spectrum, it balances and sort of puts some pause and perspective and some slowness, which I think is important. And in the reverse, the other person sort of needs some of that energy. So it's really kind of letting each other, again, influence each other in the spaces that you think you need. So I don't know. I don't know if that specifically answers your question, but I think on your end of it, you would be like, well, what do I need from this person that they're trying to get my time? Do I need to shift into relationship mode more? Like, what are they trying to tell me and what makes sense to me to do?
Right.
That's what I do, at least.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like that in advance permission slip of, okay, I'm going to go into a more passive mode now because I want to just enjoy the experience rather than I do believe that one person tends to be more future oriented. In other words, they're driving towards a brighter vision. And as long as both parties appreciate the difference, because I think the future-oriented person needs the present tense of like, let's actually enjoy some R&R here together and have a good time. And then the other person maybe needs some of that structure and that challenge of like really driving towards a future that's brighter, the macro versus the micro. The problem is, though, is that I think a lot of times, like, again, the ego tells us this person should be more like me.
Yep.
And that's just not true, because if they were more like you wouldn't be attracted to them, because it's something deeper that it is the balance that you were both looking for. So I think that's absolute fire. I appreciate you.
Yeah, we pick people because there's parts about the other person, even if they totally irritate us, that we need or crave or need more of. And if we could just be open to that, it softens those differences a little bit more,
Tory, one of the things that I read on your website again, and I was very... It's going to sound like a dumb question, I'm sure. I think a lot of my questions, they do at first, but I'll try to go a little deeper. So one of the things you do is you'll literally sit down with a couple and help them end things amicably and kind of work through a breakup in a positive light. How do you know, and not necessarily you, but maybe the people in the relationship, how do you know when this relationship has run its course? Because there's a fine line between, it's always going to be work, and then it's actually detrimental to my health and life and well-being. Like, how do you know when to call it quits?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a good question. Probably a lot of people have that question. But I think that a lot of people come to me and they've already made up their minds in a lot of scenarios. It's just kind of working through that and actually, kind of facing that. So that's usually the couples that I see that I can tell have already sort of detached. They just have to wrap their heads around it and figure out how to do it. But on the people who are sort of on the fence, it's really, relationships are hard no matter what. Obviously, with different people, you have to work on different things. And I think it's the couples who still have the energy or the desire to work at it, right? If someone's lost that, or if there's been so much disconnection for so many years and the person really just can't get back to that place where they can even put energy towards the other person, you can't sort of force that. But you can work on anything that anyone wants to work on, which again is why I say coming earlier rather than later is ideal, because sometimes people let things run its course and they're just sort of really completely disconnected at that point. It's very hard to get back on track. I mean, anything's possible, but I find those people are usually the ones that tend to want to split. They sort of already have split for many years and just come into my office to do it more formally and face it.
So Alan and I are clearly both learning a ton, and something I think I've talked about on the podcast before. If I haven't, I don't know why I haven't. If I have, it's been a long time. But when I was really low, I went to therapy, and it really helped me. It genuinely helped me a lot. I really enjoyed it. I cried like a baby, which I did not expect to do. But when I opened up and realized, like, you got some demons in there, my friend. Like,
there's stuff there, right?
There's definitely stuff there. So for me at the time, it took a girlfriend to kind of push me to go do it. And I understand that I think there's less stigma now surrounding therapy than there used to be. But how can we convince people that, number one, so many people go to therapy. It's not like, it does not make you weak. It doesn't make you broken. It doesn't make you any of those things. Number one, like, how can we convince them to go? And then number two, tell them how they're going to feel afterwards. Because I don't know if I can explain the weight that was lifted off my shoulders when I figured out, like, the things that were really affecting me that I never gave credit to.
Yeah. I mean, I think first we all have to realize that we have blind spots, and that we can't see ourselves as clearly as we want to convince ourselves that we can. And when you have someone else that's sort of sitting there with that expertise that can kind of drive you to those places, you get to know yourself and you understand yourself, and it's so freeing. It's such a different thing than having to go in always in this, like, in a crisis mode, or if something is terribly wrong. Obviously, there are scenarios there too. But I think more people, especially now in this generation, are using it more in this space to really understand themselves and have this time, this like 1 hour a week or whenever you're doing it, to like dedicate to understanding their mind. And I think the more we value that, the less stigma we have an association with it being this like last effort ditch thing that we have to do, that we're sort of forced to do. It becomes more like, wow, this actually feels really good to understand myself more and to make, and kind of create clarity around things that aren't as clear when we're trying to work it on our own.
I also want to second what Kevin said, because whether it was couples counseling or just having coaches and mentors now, where again, it's hard to see the whole picture when you're in the frame. I love what you said. We cannot see ourselves as clearly as we want to believe we can. Like, we all want to believe that we know exactly what's going on in our lives and why things are the way they are. And it's just like seeing that outside perspective. Like, I always talk to Kevin about things, and I know he has a bird's eye view of my life, obviously better than I do. So that's absolutely huge. So if you're out there right now and you're a listener and you feel like, wow, like, I really want to start making change, whether it's a coach or a therapist or a mentor or even a close friend, like, go be vulnerable with someone that isn't going to judge you. I am telling you, it's going to change your life. Like, there's no version of you not coming out on the other end better, even though it was uncomfortable at first. So I just felt compelled to say that. So Kevin was telling me, say it again.
I completely agree.
Oh, thank you, Tory. So Kevin was telling me he was hitting his watch, which means we're running out of time.
Somebody's got to keep this train on the rails.
Right. Otherwise, it will go off the mountain for sure.
That is fair.
I've seen me do it. Okay, so we have two questions that we always ask every guest. You want me to start, Kev?
You can start.
Okay. So I wear a North Star around my neck, and while we all grow and we change and we evolve, I do believe that the deepest part of us is our uniqueness, and the more we grow, the more that shines. What about you, Tory? Through all of your evolution, never changed?
Oh, that's such a good question. That never changed. I think I mean, that's a really hard question, but I want to answer it authentically.
But
But
take your time. Take your time.
yeah, well, can you give me some more like understanding of the question? Meaning
Totally.
like,
So I do believe there's a part of us that, whether it's a character trait or a certain thing that we've always sort of lived for or by, a principle, a value, really a core value. A core value is probably
okay.
the best way to describe it. One core value about you that just was always there.
I think my ability to connect. I mean, I think that's it, just because it's just been so natural my whole life, and it comes from my hope or my desire to connect to me, which I think kind of shifts over to other people. So that's just been so ingrained in me, probably even since I was little. So I think it's that, and that's definitely a value of mine.
I noticed that on your website. You say several times, "I look forward to connecting."
Yeah,
That's huge.
because that's mainly, I will tell you that that's what I do with my clients first and foremost. Is I try to genuinely create a real connection with anyone in my room, because if that's there, someone else can have the same exact advice as me, but it feels so different when you feel like someone, generally you're connected to them and it makes sense. So that is I really think that's my skill set. When people call me and ask me, they're like, "What's your style?" I'm like, "I just really, really want to know you and connect to you, and then we'll take it from there." I think that's always been a part of me.
Tory, no one will care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Yeah.
I also try to connect as deep as I can with my clients right away. Find the heartstring and run with it. That's awesome, and you're very good at that, by the way. It's
Thank
obvious
you.
that
I know.
our listeners are gonna love this episode. I can already
I'm so
anticipate.
excited.
I
Thank
feel
you.
like we're BFFs. I feel like I've known you forever. We're talking about.
I know. I feel like we could keep going.
Oh,
but
for
we
sure.
We gotta stop the train.
We will do an in-person event. You're in New York, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we will. We're in Massachusetts, so we will do an in-person eventually. We set the intention to do it with every guest, and you're so close. We'll come down
we
and
can
we'll
so do it.
Yes,
Yeah, that
yes.
would be exciting.
for sure.
You keep referencing this room, and I'm picturing it. Like, we'll bring the equipment. It'll be great.
Yeah, it's gonna be a whole thing. All right, so my question, I don't know if it's gonna be as good as Alan's, but
Probably not.
Okay.
probably not. So I think that we have a limited amount of time here on this planet: 90 years, 100 years, 120 if you're Alan.
Oh yeah.
And we get to do with that time with what as we please. What do you hope to accomplish with your time here on Earth? What is your goal? What do you want to leave behind?
I want to leave behind. Well, I have to tell you, I'm in the space now as a mom, where my family, I think, is I've been humbled to this being the most important thing. But I think just making people feel loved and accepted and heard and seen, and that's part of what I do with work, but my Instagram and in my family really is just making that, because I know the quote, I think it's Mother Teresa, where she says, "If you want to change the world, go home and love your family." And that I feel that on a core level at this point, and I think that extends outward, obviously. So that would be it.
I think that's coming through for sure. Okay, so you survived the hyperconscious gauntlet. Tell people where they can find you on Instagram, your website, where they can hire you, all of that happy jazz. Plug away.
Oh, all right. So my Instagram is NY Therapist, so New York Therapist. And all on there, you can kind of click on working with me. I do video sessions too, more coaching style. And my website is emotionpsychotherapy.com. And I look forward to connecting with anybody. But I really appreciate also being on here and connecting with you guys. It's been a lot of fun.
This has been awesome, Tory. So to quote something that you wrote on your Instagram, the biggest indicator of wisdom is awareness, not age. There's a great John Maxwell quote that I love where he says, "We think wisdom comes with age. Sometimes age comes alone." Tory, you are the wisest wizard. I appreciate you coming on the show.
Wisest
Thank
wizard.
you.
And some would say that hyperconsciousness is awareness. So you're very hyperconscious. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much, guys.
Before we hop off, Tory, if you could leave the listeners with a 10-second blip, something that they might be able to take with them throughout today and the rest of their week, what would it be? Just a quick 10-second thing.
Be gentle with yourself. You are working and growing and moving, and be gentle.
She was ready for that.
Right.
She was ready
I
for
just got
that.
ready for that.
I like it.
Well done.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Tory Eletto.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you enjoyed this episode where Alan and I were lucky enough to sit down with Tory Eletto as Alan hammers the microphone stand and makes a whole ton of noise that was unnecessary completely, but everything's going to be fine. Up next, we have a very special 5-minute clinic on forgiveness. So it was Father's Day when we recorded these episodes, and I had a moment with my father that I've never had before. So that is something that I talk about in this short, I think it's 10 minutes because it was very, very emotional and it was on the heartstrings for both of us. But we're going to talk about forgiveness in our 5-minute clinic.
So Kevin talked a little bit about forgiving someone else and what that can do for you. I talked a little bit about forgiving yourself for some of the mistakes that you've made. Folks, making mistakes is proof you're trying. If you're learning and growing, in hindsight, you're going to look back and say, I can't believe I said that. I can't believe I did that. But that is how you grow. There is no other way. And forgiving yourself for the mistakes that you've made is the best way to move forward and more effectively proceed.
And if you have 10 minutes, you can hammer out that episode. Hopefully, we will teach you something and maybe you will learn something about forgiveness. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we will talk to you on Monday.
Talk to you soon.
Bye. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for listening to another episode of the Hyperconscious Podcast.
Going hyperconscious will absolutely change your life, because if you understand why something is the way it is, now you have the power to change it. If you going hyperconscious with us has changed your life in any way, please share this episode with one of your friends, because the more people that go hyperconscious, the better this world's going to be for everybody.
And if you would kindly leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, that would help us make more people hyperconscious, and we would be greatly appreciative.
Thank you.
Bye.